I'm Greg Groogan, and welcome to a special post-Turkey Day, guy-heavy edition of What's Your Point, where our analysts call it like they see it. Let's greet them. Starting us off, well-regarded Houston political strategist Keir Murray. Next up, Jasper Scherer, political reporter for the Houston Chronicle. In the 3 spot, Charles Blain, founder of Urban Reform. Batting cleanup, veteran political commentator and communications pro Mustafa Tameez. And closing us out, Rice University political analyst Mark Jones. Let's begin. In the Lone Star State, the main event matchup is now all but set. Pending his likely victory in a tune-up primary versus GOP challengers Allen West and Don Huffines, Governor Greg Abbott will face Democrat Beto O'Rourke in a winner-take-all slugfest next fall. Politically battered in his failed presidential run, O'Rourke is looking to ignite the kind of progressive excitement and turnout which characterized his razor-tight battle with Ted Cruz. With a colossal war chest approaching 60 million, Abbott will be a formidable opponent. That said, the governor's statewide approval rating has been sliding in the wrong direction, and a vast majority of Texans are still furious over last February's deadly grid failure and getting stuck with a multi-billion-dollar tab they'll be forced to pay on their monthly gas and electric bills for decades. Okay, panel, 345 days until the election. How do you size this up? I'm starting with you, Mark Jones.
I think right now we'd have to look at Beto O'Rourke as a real long shot, but with someone with the potential for victory. The difficulties Beto runs into is that, unlike the case in 2018, he's a much more known quantity, and it is a known quantity to be more on the left than in the middle. In 2018, he could present himself as a post-partisan with a moderate voting record in Congress. After his failed 2020 presidential bid, he's seen as just another national Democrat. He renounced a lot of his centrist positions on oil and natural gas, law enforcement, immigration, and most notably Second Amendment rights. And so he really starts off at a disadvantage. Throw into all of that the fact that Joe Biden and his administration remain very unpopular, and that's a recipe for a defeat for Beto O'Rourke. So he could become a 3-time loser in a little less than a year.
Keir, if you were advising Beto on this campaign, what would you tell him?
He needs as much as possible to make this race a referendum on Greg Abbott rather than a choice between himself and the governor. I think from Beto's standpoint, if he can turn this into an evaluation by the public of the job that Greg Abbott has done over the last several years, that's going to put him in a stronger position to win than if it becomes a typical Republican versus Democrat matchup in Texas, where Republicans still hold a several-point advantage in the natural electorate.
Mustafa, Abbott has tacked to the right, so to speak, with these 2 primary challengers. Is he vulnerable in your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we're talking about Beto O'Rourke running for a 3rd time, but he raised $2.2 million in 24 hours. That's the biggest raise for any candidate in the history of gubernatorial races across the country. So he has a lot of momentum. He has a lot of excitement. And every time Texans get their bill for electricity, they know that the governor is responsible for that, and that bill is going to continue to go higher. There's very little that's been done, if anything, on the electric grid failure.
Jasper Scherer, you're in Austin. What's the scuttlebutt there about this race? Do they think it's going to be the Donnybrook we political reporters hope for?
It's going to be a heavyweight battle. I mean, I think, everyone's spot on that it's a bit of an uphill climb for O'Rourke, but I think the real test for him is just going to be how effectively he can reset his image now that he's appealing to a completely different electorate than he did in his last race. So, one thing he has working in his advantage, both he and Abbott are relatively unpopular among independents. So that group still might be a bit up for grabs for both of them.
All right, Charles Blain, Abbott's usually very high approval rating has been slipping. Does that concern you as somebody who generally is right of center?
Not so much. I mean, they're slipping, but they're not slipping as much as kind of the national and state attitude on the Democratic Party. And I think Abbott has done a lot of things that he should do, spending a lot of time at the border, talking about a lot of these issues, calling out where he sees these failures of the Democratic Party, and Beto's going to have to contend with that because he is a representation of that. And he's a wounded candidate in a tougher race. Abbott isn't Cruz. He's a stellar fundraiser. He's relatively well liked with the base, and it's going to be a hard race for Beto. One thing I do think he has is to his advantage is a well-oiled machine, but I think it's going to help down ballot candidates more so than him putting him over the top.
Mark Jones, Beto O'Rourke is not backing off his presidential run statement that he would like to pull back or confiscate, buy back semi-automatic rifles like the AR-15. Does that hurt him in Texas?
It does. And I mean, perhaps not so much on that specific issue of AR-15s, but it just aids the Abbott campaign in being able to portray him as someone who's against Second Amendment rights and who, if he has his way, will go from AR-15s to other weapons. And before you know it, the only gun people could have is a single shot 22. So I think, the Abbott campaign will use it against him. He is, though, probably right to try to spin it to his advantage because no one's going to forget that clip from the presidential race and Abbott's going to repeat it ad nauseum. So you might as well try to embrace it and try to spin it to your favor rather than try to walk it back, because that's just not going to be possible with that video evidence.
Keir, two positions that Texans have taken, or at least the majority of Texans. One is they favor legalization of marijuana and they favor a woman's right to choose. Would you advise Beto to spend a lot of time on those two issues?
I don't know if I'd advise him to spend a lot of time on it. The marijuana issue is an interesting one because it's a constituency that a lot of cases is a single issue constituency. So I think there is some advantage to get perhaps some libertarian leaning voters who feel strongly about that issue into his camp. Abortion is a thornier issue in Texas as it is nationwide. For example, there are a number of members of the historic Democratic constituencies who are socially conservative and are not particularly enamored of abortion rights. That said, I think most Texans polling shows think the abortion law that was passed in the last session went too far. While, of course, have the context of the Supreme Court likely considering an abortion case out of Mississippi this fall and potentially have a ruling by next June that may affect the race in some regard as well.
Real quick, Mustafa, how much money can Beto raise? 15 seconds.
I think, look, $2.2 million in 24 hours, he raised almost $80 million last time. So this, with no limits, he is going to be more than competitive financially with Governor Abbott.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Up next, the emerging Democratic primary battle for the right to challenge Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. And later, Texas Latinos crossing party lines. Word to Democrats, you have a problem. Those who follow Texas politics by either inclination or necessity fully understand the raw power wielded by the office of Lieutenant Governor, a post currently held by Republican Dan Patrick. To put it simply, no bill, no budget, no congratulatory proclamation gets through the legislature without his say-so. Democrats have coveted that degree of stroke since Bob Bullock left the office more than 2 decades ago. In 2018, Houston businessman and Biden advisor Mike Collier got within 4.5 points of Patrick and believes he can erase that gap this cycle. But first, Collier must get past former George Bush aide turned Democrat Matthew Dowd and Carrollton State Representative Michelle Beckley. Panel, 2 questions. Is Dan Patrick at all vulnerable, and which of these Democrats will be his likely opponent? I'm going to start with you, Mustafa.
Well, look, I think that Matthew Dowd is an interesting candidate. It's very hard for Republicans to call him socialist or all the things that generally call Democrats just all the time. So Matthew Dowd is effective. I think he also has the ability to get on television across the country. And for Texas, if you're going to be known, you have to hit the national media market. And Matthew Dowd's got that advantage. Lieutenant Governor Patrick is vulnerable. He has been vulnerable. He has not had a significant challenge, and this cycle he's likely to get it.
All right, Mark, what's your take on this?
Right now, I would not say that the lieutenant governor is very vulnerable. As a somewhat down ballot race, it would require a Democrat to have a high profile and raise quite a bit of money. And neither of these three candidates, I think, are going to be able to do that. I think we're also in a situation where, with the Biden administration continuing to go on a downward streak or cycle, the national conditions are just not going to be favorable as they were in 2018 when the national conditions were heavily favorable, and that's where Collier came in with a chance, really close of defeating Patrick, at least within 5 points. This time around, I don't think Patrick's going to be surprised. Collier's probably the strongest candidate there of the group. Beckley is so far to the left. She's arguably the most liberal or second most liberal House member. And Dowd, I just don't see him crossing the finish line in the Democratic primary as the next Republican.
Jasper, what are you hearing about this Democratic primary? Is Dowd being viewed as an interloper, a Johnny-come-lately, so to speak?
Yeah, I think it's the polling we've seen so far. It looks like it's still completely up for grabs. Before Beckley got into the race, Dowd and Collier were both sort of jockeying for the lead, if you could even call it that, because there's so many voters who haven't even heard of the candidates or made up their minds yet. But one interesting thing to watch with Beckley is, if she seems to sort of occupy a different lane than Dowd and Collier, who, might be sort of vying for similar constituencies. So that could be one thing that could help Beckley in the primary, along with, like Mark was saying, her rather liberal voting record.
Keir, what are you hearing about this race?
Well, it's early days, but I think, the entrance of Beckley into the race is interesting because 60% of Democratic primary voters in Texas are women. You can assume that the primary electorate knows virtually nothing about any of these candidates, and there may be some more who join in the next 3 weeks or so before filing closes. So regardless of issue and policy positions or ideology, I suspect that Beckley is in a strong position to at least make a runoff simply based on her gender. And who gets that other spot with her, I think, remains to be seen. I tend to agree with Mark that I think Collier may be advantaged, having run a couple of times statewide before. That wouldn't surprise me to see a runoff between those two, and then it just comes down to who would come back in the runoff situation.
We'll keep our eye on it. Still ahead, indicted, under investigation, and badmouthed by challengers from both parties. Can Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton still prevail in the upcoming Republican primary? The evolving race to be Texas Attorney General is a crowded place. A hefty field drawn by the perceived vulnerability of the current office holder, Ken Paxton, who is still under indictment for alleged securities fraud and more recently the target of a federal bribery and abuse of power investigation triggered by his once trusted lieutenants. Land Commissioner George P. Bush, former state Supreme Court Justice Eva Guzman, State Representative Matt Krause, and potentially Congressman Louis Gohmert are looking to dislodge Paxton in the Republican primary. Panel, despite his well-documented problems, Paxton is still popular with much of the GOP base. Is that true, Charles?
Yeah, it's certainly true. And I think, Gohmert, if he gets into the race, and Krause, who has gotten into the race but may not stay in the race, are in there to pull from Paxton's base. They're pulling from that same conservative base. The only difference is they don't have the name ID, the money, the power of incumbency, or the endorsement of Donald Trump. And so I think without that, it stifles their campaigns a little bit. I think Paxton's still wildly popular among the grassroots activists in the base, the folks who are going to come out in a Republican primary. And Eva Guzman and George P. just don't really excite them, and actually turns them off to some extent when you're talking about that right wing of the base. And so I think Paxton is kind of coasting towards a re-election, but not without a runoff maybe.
Mark Jones, you agree with that? What do we got, 3 months until the primary?
Especially if Gohmert gets in the race and Krause stays in the race, then a runoff is looking increasingly likely. If both of them end up not running, it's just Guzman or Bush, then Paxton might have the ability to win in the first round. But I think right now we'd have to assume he's going to be the Republican standard bearer because, as Charles was mentioning, he's wildly popular among the Republican base and he has that coveted Trump endorsement. And then when he goes to the general election, he is the weakest member of the Republican herd and the easiest for a Democrat to knock out. But until the Democrats recruit a top-tier candidate to run against them, someone like Julian Castro or Joaquin Castro, he may very well continue to be Attorney General for 4 more years, despite the fact that, as was mentioned, he's under FBI investigation. He's been indicted, and there are a whole host of personal and financial issues surrounding him.
So the Democrats in this race are simultaneously criticizing Paxton as hard as they can, but also cheering for him in the Republican primary. Is that right, Mustafa?
Absolutely. Look, if you look historically, the race that flips a state is not the governor, lieutenant governor, or senator. It is the attorney general race. That one particular race has been hallmarked as when a state flips. And the strong candidate that's coming out of the Valley, Rochelle Garza, is someone who's taken on Paxton in the courtroom and has won. She's very fiery. She's got hunger, and I think that people are going to learn more and more about her in the coming days and weeks.
Jasper, have you been able to figure out why Guzman and George P. Bush haven't gained any traction?
They're primarily making the argument, it seems, that at least from Bush's perspective, that Paxton is both, the most beatable Republican if elected. So, trying to make the pitch that we don't want to risk losing this office to the Democrats. And then also just, it feels like the kind of the focus on the scandal, emphasizing the various legal issues that Paxton is having, just is going absolutely nowhere with Republican voters, at least, or, it's still early. We've got a lot of months left until the primary election actually happens. So we'll see if that starts to, if they start to make any inroads as we get closer to March. But at the moment, it just seems like that's not resonating in any way, shape, or form.
Keir, would you say this race is the best chance for Democrats to win statewide since Bob Bullock did it back, what was it, mid-90s?
I think 94 was the last time you had a Democratic statewide victory. I would say it's the most likely opportunity. And if you're whoever the prospective nominee for Attorney General on the Democratic side is, you have to be happy that Beto O'Rourke is announced for governor, simply because even though, odds are he will fall short in the race against Abbott, his, well-known brand among Democratic voters, his ability to fundraise will likely lift the boat enough that a Democrat running for Attorney General against an unpopular and damaged Ken Paxton will actually have a shot to win. And it's probably the Democrats' best shot to pick up a seat statewide next year.
Real quick, Mark, what are the chances the Biden Justice Department comes out with their findings on the FBI investigation before the primary?
I would say probably not before the primary. If I were the Biden administration, I would actually come out with those right after the runoff, because the goal would be to have a damaged Paxton, who's under indictment, going into the general election, but without the Republican Party being able to replace him at the polls.
Gonna leave it there. Up next, to the winner go the spoils. With control of every facet of state government, Texas Republicans draw new election maps. Will the fresh political boundaries strengthen their grip on power? Welcome back. I think it's absolutely fair to say that in Texas politics, controlling the state legislature and governorship during a post-census session amounts to a monopoly on some pretty priceless coin of the realm, so to speak. Case in point, the recent redistricting process, which, after all the cracking and packing, appears to have consolidated the current Republican grip on power throughout much of the Lone Star State. Panel, given the new political boundaries and President Biden's currently abysmal approval ratings, have prospects of flipping Texas blue been dealt a serious setback? Starting with you, Mark Jones.
Well, at least for 2022, there is no chance whatsoever that Democrats are going to flip either the Texas House or the Texas Senate. And the maps have been drawn particularly well for the Texas Senate, such that it's going to be tough for Democrats to flip at any time this decade if conditions don't change pretty dramatically. The House, they've locked in a majority right now of between 80 and 85 seats that could get a little higher in a bad year for Democrats. And for the U.S. House, they've also locked in a majority, at least 23 seats and potentially as many as 25. So Republicans essentially controlled things. They were able to draw tailor-made maps, and they've locked in some really strong majorities. And since we're in the post-Shelby v. Holder world, there is no Department of Justice or U.S. Federal District Court of the District of Columbia that needs to approve them. So we're here to go.
All right, Mustafa, jump in here. You keep an eye on this process.
Well, I think it's what Keir talked about a little bit earlier. The case that's coming out of Mississippi on abortion rights is likely to be overturned. The Supreme Court's hearing in December. The judgment will come out June of next year. When that happens, if people thought women's marches were big after Trump got elected, you'll see the largest movement amongst women since the suffrage movement. And that momentum going into 2022 may be what meant for Republicans in 2010 after the Obama election. This pendulum shift after Roe versus Wade being overturned will favor the Democrats in a way that these lines may not even matter.
Okay, Keir, you've been watching it as well. Have the Republicans strengthened their grip on power? And do you have any confidence the courts will overturn the maps they've drawn?
I think they have strengthened their grip on power. The map drawing process, from my standpoint, was largely an incumbent protection plan. In both the Senate and the congressional maps especially, they have sort of locked in the status quo for the foreseeable future, which will reduce the number of competitive races in that regard. I think the House is a little bit less so and probably will be the chamber that will become competitive the fastest. But generally speaking, I think they have locked in power for the foreseeable future, at least with regard to legislative seats.
Jasper Scherer, you've written about what happened in Austin with the redrawing of maps. What were your takeaways?
I think this is going to put a lot more emphasis on the statewide races this year. In 2020, we saw a ton of money, a lot of it from outside the state, pouring into these state house races in a way that we really hadn't seen before. Is pretty unprecedented. So I think, if you look at the Houston area, there are a couple seats that remain competitive. Jim Murphy, state rep out in West Houston, is retiring, and his district was actually drawn to be a little bit more competitive than it was before. And so it will be interesting to see whether the candidates running for those seats that remain competitive are able to attract the type of money and attention that was paid to the state house races back in 2020. And at the congressional level, it's kind of the same thing. In 2020, we saw, and I think there are 10, maybe 11 seats that the Democrats were targeting in Texas. And this year it's, maybe one at best.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Still ahead, the growing number of Texas Latinos crossing party lines. Is it just a temporary phenomenon or a long-term trend in the Lone Star State? Welcome back. 4 out of every 10 citizens in the Lone Star State identify as Hispanic. And given the rapid rate of growth, it appears just a matter of time before Latinos comprise the majority of Texas. Furthermore, despite their historically lagging voter participation rate, capturing the lion's share of the Latino vote in Texas has been linchpin to Democratic prospects, and why recent polling should be setting off alarm bells. In September, the Dallas Morning News UT Tyler survey found 54% of Texas Hispanics disapproved of President Joe Biden's performance. Panel, you all know the ancillary developments here. Zapata County going Republican for the first time since Warren Harding was president. McAllen electing a Republican mayor, and most recently, Representative Ryan Guillen deserting the Democrats and joining the GOP. Are Republicans excited about that, Charles Blain?
It seems like, and you can tell that they're spending more and more time at the border. And I mean, Republicans from across the country now, elected officials, are flying out to the border to get their picture out there and show that they're doing something. But I think it goes to show that Hispanic voters, just like black voters, but I think Hispanic voters are doing it faster now, are more conservative naturally when you look at a lot of the issues that they deal with. And for instance, with the left not necessarily addressing, or at least not calling it a crisis, the border issue, the Hispanics who live at the border are contending with that, and they're going to have to make a decision over if they're going to continue to support a party that isn't necessarily addressing that, or a party that is fighting for more funding for that. Same thing with life. A lot of Hispanics, just like a lot of older black folks, are more pro-life than they are pro-choice. And then you have cost of living increases that we're dealing with, and we're seeing very heavily now. And so when you compound all those things, it makes sense that many Hispanics are looking towards a more conservative option, whether they call themselves Republicans or not.
Okay, little known fact, Mark Jones is fully bilingual and consults in South America. Mark, how do you view this phenomenon? Is it real? Do you think that Latinos are crossing?
Well, I think when we look back at voting numbers, Republicans in Texas have historically done quite well with the Latino electorate, winning between 35 and 45% of the vote. At the same time, on many issues, when we're thinking about the Latino electorate, it's not a monolith. And so some work we do at the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation, where I'm an analyst, is we highlight sort of the diversity within the Latino community. And so on issues like border security, you see people down in South Texas being very supportive of Governor Abbott's border policies pretty much across the board. And then even outside of the valley, when you get into certain communities such as evangelical Christian, evangelical Protestant Latinos and Hispanics, they're very supportive of the governor's policies. So it's a very diverse electorate, and so you can't really think of it as a monolith that it's going to say just support immigration because they're Latinos. Latinos have a very nuanced and very diverse position on immigration, as well as many other issues.
Okay, Keir, should Democrats be worried about this?
They should take this problem seriously. I think one of the things we're seeing is that the urban versus rural divide that's happened across the country and in Texas politically, the Hispanic community is not immune to that divide. What we're seeing in particular are Latino elected officials and residents in rural South Texas gravitating a little bit more toward the Republican Party and conservative movement, whereas in the big urban areas, they still tend to lean more Democratic. But my view is that if Democrats are smart, they'll start treating the Latino community as well as the Black and Asian American communities as persuasion voters that you have to convince to vote for your side, not just assume they will do so because of their identity.
Mustafa, what's your take on this?
I think there are also some border economics. I mean, when you live on the border, the economy is a lot about the border patrol because we have so many, and those issues, as well as just the cross-border trading, is something that Democrats need to understand better. On the other hand, I would also say we have to look at the math. There are as many Latinos in South Texas than there are in Precinct 2 right here in Harris County. And so sometimes we see a county in the South flip, or a particular mayor's race, and when you look at how many people live in that town, it's 20,000 or 200,000 in a county. So the numbers are still in the big urban areas, and Latino community there is heavily with Democrats.
All right, Jasper, this has got to be on your radar. I mean, Hispanic families who've been here 4, 5, 6 generations have very little kinship with folks who are new arrivals, and for those folks who are undocumented. How are you reporting, or is this on y'all's radar?
Absolutely, and that's a good point you make there. I think one other thing to keep in mind is that Governor Abbott, near the top of the ballot, he's historically performed pretty well among Hispanic voters, both in his especially in his 2014 campaign for governor, and even in 2018, running for re-election while Trump was president, he still did pretty well. And on the other hand, Beto O'Rourke, we've seen, has had some vulnerability among Latino voters. If you look back to the 2018 primary, for Senate, he famously underperformed in some of the areas in the Valley and border communities. So that's one thing to keep in mind, just how that race will affect the ones farther down the ballot. I think O'Rourke, and then especially with immigration, you've already seen him sort of going after Biden a little bit. He's clearly not going to be, he's not going to shy away from taking aim at some of Biden's border policies, just given how unpopular they've been.
We're going to leave it there. Still to come, the fascinating Republican primary battle to replace retiring Congressman Kevin Brady. Could it turn into a proxy fight between major GOP players? But up next, are Republicans here and across the country eager to reboard the Trump train? We will discuss whether the former president's grip on the GOP is slipping or growing stronger. Fact, Donald J. Trump may have lost the 2020 election, but he remains far and away the most influential force in the Republican Party. From his headquarters in Mar-a-Lago, the 45th president launches a daily barrage of missives and pronouncements with zero indication he's willing to fade into the political background and make room for new, younger, less divisive leadership. A master of self-marketing, Trump hints regarding a 2024 run have become increasingly less coy, Panel, do you see any move among top Republicans to disengage from the Trump train, or are they, afraid of the repercussions? I'm going to start with you, Charles Blain.
From what I've seen, most of the Republicans who wanted to step away did so. The big Republicans who had kind of an image to be concerned about stepped away post January 6th. Everyone else seems to have stayed on board, and rightfully so, because I think they've recognized that he has a significant ability to fundraise, and his stamp of approval goes a long way. And so if they want the credibility that comes with that, with the Republican electorate, which he has a deep hold on, and they want the money that comes with that, then they're going to stay on board. And so I think everyone that we've seen who's been on board now is probably going to stay on board until alliances start forming for the 2024 election. But the ones who wanted to jump ship, I think, use January 6th as an opportunity to do that.
Mustafa, does the Trump train just keep on chugging?
Well, the grand old party now is the Trump Republican Party, where he runs a populist movement from a country club that he owns. It's a pretty scary. It's becoming a extreme movement, alienating most Americans. And although they have a short-term gain in this, they have a long-term loss.
Mark Jones, Nikki Haley, DeSantis, does anybody make a move?
It's difficult. As I mentioned, he remains very popular among the Republican base. And I think all those individuals are going to wait on the side, hoping that he, in the end, says, I'm not going to run. And then by having not attacked him and not sort of betrayed him, they will hope to be able to gather the support of his backers. But I think right now, he's just far too powerful, far too influential. And if you go after him, then it pretty much dooms any future presidential bid for 2024, assuming he doesn't run.
Keir, would most Democrats like to see the former president back in the game?
Absolutely. He remains pretty unpopular with the public at large, despite his favorable numbers among Republicans. However, I do think his star has faded a little bit. If you look at Glenn Youngkin, for example, in Virginia, who distanced himself pretty decisively from Trump down the stretch and was able to win that election without having him in the state campaigning for him. And Trump's absence from social media, luster's gone a little bit, I think.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Up next, the job review for Democratic rule in Washington is coming in the midterms. Can Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi right their party ship in time to avoid a wipeout in 2022? The midterms are now just 11 months away, and Republicans are now a prohibitive favorite to retake the House. That's not me talking, that's Vegas, where odds makers place the Democratic chances of holding the majority at 18%. Same goes in the Senate, albeit odds makers rate the battle for the equally split upper chamber far closer. Panel, the border mess, the debacle leaving Afghanistan, troubling inflation, and a social spending bill which redefines big-ticket item have collectively depressed the president's approval rating to around 40%. What must he do to turn it around? Going to you, Mark Jones.
Well, the bad news for Democrats is if the election were held today, they certainly would lose control of the House and the Senate. The good news is that those elections aren't going to happen for 11 months. And so there's quite a bit of time for Biden to right the ship, raise his approval ratings. Part of that means getting the economy back going, but without the inflationary pressures. And the other means would be avoiding some of the political problems that they've had related to immigration, particularly when we're thinking about success in states like Arizona and Nevada as we move forward.
Keir, jump in here.
Well, I think the one thing we haven't discussed is the hangover from COVID, which has been now going on for close to 2 years, and this sort of expectation on among the public that we would be past this crisis now, and a malaise that's contributed to among many Americans. If, in addition to the economic and other factors talked about, if we can emerge continually from that COVID crisis, people feeling more normality in their lives bit by bit, I think also that can help Biden and the Democrats in the midterms next year. But it's a tough environment for them right now.
Mustafa, how does the president pivot?
Well, look, I think the passing this legislation, bipartisan and $1 trillion is going to help. I think there's another one coming up that the House passed, which will pass from the Senate. Not the same bill, but something like that will pass from the Senate. what happens next is people are going to remember what January 6th insurrection was. And they're going to start to understand that if Republicans control the House of Representatives, if President Trump is on the ballot and he loses, the people that were part of the insurrection will be running Congress. And that is an actual detriment to our democracy. And people are going to remember that.
Jasper, final 30 seconds to you.
Yeah, I would just say that I think people are looking for Democrats to sort of establish more consistently that they are able to govern when they give them power. So kind of what Mustafa was mentioning, just getting this final spending bill across the finish line will probably help. But, you know, especially if you look back here in Texas, immigration might be the issue that's, you know, the biggest point of vulnerability for Democrats. And I think they know that. Beto O'Rourke seems to know that from his early comments on the trail. So, you know, that's one of the ones they'll really have to turn around.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Still ahead, the Republican battle to be Congressman Kevin Brady's successor. Turns out two of the biggest names in the Texas GOP have taken opposite sides. Texas Congressional District 8 has been Kevin Brady country for nearly a quarter century. But when the former House Ways and Means chairman and author of the Trump tax cuts announced his pending retirement, it triggered a Republican scramble to be his successor. Former Navy SEAL Morgan Luttrell, twin brother of lone survivor Marcus Luttrell, has drawn the influential support of Congressman Dan Crenshaw. Meantime, former Brady campaign manager Christian Collins has drawn the recent endorsement of Senator Ted Cruz. Panel, what do you make of this primary battle, which has drawn, at my last count, 17 contenders? I'm going to start with you, Charles Blain.
Yeah, so it's definitely going to come down to Collins or Luttrell. But what's interesting is it's setting up a number of proxy battles. One of them is this kind of star power versus grassroots. I mean, you have Luttrell, who's a regular on Fox News, who has Dan Crenshaw supporting him, has Ronnie Jackson, who was very close to President Trump, supporting him. And there's a lot of star power there. Then you have Christian Collins, who worked for Kevin Brady, built kind of that grassroots church network that Kevin Brady had going into his last election, also very involved in the grassroots, has been for years, and I think received $245,000 from the U.S. House Freedom Caucus's affiliated PAC, and so they're supporting him. And so it's going to be this interesting proxy battle between grassroots and star power, and I think grassroots is probably going to win in the end of the day, but it's certainly going to be one to watch.
Jasper, you watching this one?
Absolutely. It's one of the more interesting competitive primaries this year, I think, in the Houston area at least. And I think it'll be a good, another good test of sort of the strength of veterans running as Republican candidates. You know, we've seen a lot of that, especially at the congressional level recently. Look at Wesley Hunt, the former helicopter pilot who 2020 ran unsuccessfully against Lizzie Fletcher in Congressional District 7 in Houston, and he really, kind of cleaned up in the Republican primary. So, he's running for Congress again, doesn't seem to have quite as competitive of a challenge. But, I think the other thing to watch in this primary, it's been fascinating to see how Crenshaw especially has been positioning himself in the lead up to, 2024 and other years that he might run for statewide office. I think everyone seems to assume that that's the route he's headed. So just looking at who he's, allying himself with and just what moves he's been making has been really fascinating.
Mark, what do you think of our narrative of a proxy battle up in CD8?
I think it'll be combined a proxy battle, but also I think, as Jasper was mentioning, this grassroots versus sort of star power battle. In the end, it's going to be a race that is decided in a runoff, which will probably be a very low turnout runoff in May, because with all the candidates in this race, I don't think any candidate crosses that 50% plus one threshold. And we have a whole set of new voters in the district who weren't under Kevin Brady's district, and that probably helps Luttrell a little bit. That whole western part of Harris County that used to be Michael McCall's district is now in this new District 8. And that's one where Collins really doesn't have the experience, because that wasn't part of Brady's district when he was involved with it.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. When we come back, the Harris County power play, how Democrats used redistricting to minimize their chances of losing control. In what many see as turnabout fair play for the Republican election maps drawn in Austin, the Democratic majority on Harris County Commissioners Court has formulated a pretty drastic reconfiguration of the 4 precincts. New lines aimed at whittling away Republican chance of resurgence. Meantime, Harris County Judge Lena Hidalgo is up for re-election, and according to a very reliable source, will draw a significant primary opponent before the December 13th filing deadline. What do you make of this stuff? I'm going to start with you, Mustafa.
Look, I think that that Precinct 4 race is going to be an interesting one. Judge Leslie Briones has filed for that race. I think she's a strong candidate, Harvard graduate, Yale Law School, a sitting judge in Harris County. I think she's going to be a top-tier candidate for it.
Keir, your take.
I think that primary will be competitive. I think in the November election, it's a seat that Democrats are likely to pick up, but not guaranteed to do so. Similarly, Judge Hidalgo, I think, will be favored for re-election both in the primary and November, but there are no guarantees in politics.
All right, Charles Blain, you keep an eye on Commissioner's Court. What do you make of things?
Yeah, I wouldn't write off Cagle. He's a fierce campaigner, and he is dedicated to getting the constituents that he represents to know him, especially the new ones brought in under this redrawing. And I think the Republican primary for the county judge and the Democratic primary for the county judge are going to be ones to watch and see who makes it out of it.
All right, Mark Jones, you watch this, the drawing of these boundaries. What did you make of it?
Well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Republicans engaged in a pretty extreme partisan gerrymander out of Austin. Democrats in Harris County engaged in a pretty extreme partisan gerrymander. But turnabout's fair play, so I think that's par for the course. Now, where I think with Lena Hidalgo, I think anybody trying to defeat her in the Democratic primary is facing a real uphill battle.
All right, Jasper, you're based in Austin now, but you watched all of these players for several years. What's your take?
Yeah, Mustafa was mentioning Leslie Briones. She's already drawn at least one primary opponent, Gina Kalani, former state rep from West Harris County. So I think Keir's right. That's going to be a competitive race. And as for Judge Hidalgo, one thing to keep in mind anytime you're talking about commissioners' court races, no matter who's running, it's really hard to unseat them. They get a lot of donors from folks who are trying to, win their influence on votes. So and Hidalgo's established a fairly prominent stature, around the state and nationwide. So I think that'll probably help her raise a lot of money.
All right, Charles Blain, I want to ask you this in a real quick response. Can Jack Cagle hold his seat?
I think so. He's already started getting out there to introduce himself to the new constituents in the precinct, and so I really think he can. It's going to depend, though, really on the top of the ticket. That's really what's going to drive folks in that election.
All right, we're leaving it there. Thanks for joining us. The conversation continues on a national level next with Fox News Sunday and host Chris Wallace. From all of us here, have a safe and healthy week.